Good morning, and welcome to today's kickoff of the Chamber's Future of Work series. During our pandemic experience, the way we live and work changed. One of the most profound and lasting changes will affect how and where many of us do our jobs. Approximately 1/3 of the U.S. workforce are in jobs that can be done remotely. And right now, both business leaders and employees are in a moment of trying to figure out what will all that mean. Last month, the state released a report, The Future of Work in Massachusetts. The report analyzed pandemic-driven trends and how they will impact our region's economy and public policy decisions moving forward. The Chamber has identified this as an opportunity to publicly discuss the reality and vision for the Commonwealth and our regional business community. This series will share information and resources that will ultimately help leaders and employees in the public and private sectors share their thinking, stay ahead of the trends, and keep Greater Boston's competitive edge in the global marketplace. Today, we are joined by an impressive slate of business and government leaders to help us make sense of the biggest takeaways from the state's report and the path forward. Before we get started, a few logistics. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be shared on the Chamber's YouTube page shortly after the presentation. Please be sure to submit your questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A feature on your screen and engage with other attendees in the chat. Before we get started, I want to begin with a huge thank you to Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts and its president and CEO, Andrew Dreyfus. Blue Cross Blue Shield is not only today's sponsor, but as I mentioned earlier, this event kicks off a series of Future of Work events the Chamber will host over the next year, all made possible by our friends at Blue Cross Blue Shield. We appreciate their support in this new venture, which will certainly prove to be critical to the future of our region. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Debbie Williams, Senior Vice President, Chief Sales Officer for Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts, to introduce today's speaker. Thank you for being here today, Debbie.
Thank you, Jim. I'm very excited to be here today to kick off this new partnership with the Chamber. On behalf of Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts, it's my pleasure to introduce today's panel. First, we are thrilled to have Dr. Paula Johnson, President of Wellesley College, joining us today. Dr. Johnson is recognized internationally as an innovator who has brought her broad range of experience as a researcher, educator, and expert in healthcare, public health, and health policy to bear in the effort to advance the well-being of women. Welcome, Dr. Johnson. Next, joining us from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, I'm happy to welcome Secretary Mike Keneally, who leads the housing and economic development for the state. In this role since 2018, Secretary Keneally leads the administration's efforts to strengthen Massachusetts' leadership in the innovation economy while overseeing significant investments in affordable housing. Thanks for being here, Secretary Keneally. Also joining us is Jules Seeley, Senior Partner at McKinsey & Company. Jules leads McKinsey's global advanced analytics and digital work in the travel, transport, and logistics practice. Jules has developed deep experience in servicing transport and industrial clients across the private and public sectors in areas such as operational efficiency and transportation, regulatory strategy, talent, capital investment, maintenance, commercial sales, and loyalty and digital transformation. Thank you, Jules. Next, we have Scott Kuto, Head of North America for Columbia Threadneedle Investments. Scott has 27 years of industry experience and oversees a number of U.S. business lines, including U.S. intermediary, private client advisory, product and marketing, with a primary focus on delivering for clients across channels. Glad to have you with us, Scott. Last but not least, leading today's conversation is Micho Spring, Chair, Global Corporate Practice and President of Weber Shandrick, New England. Micho's practice at Weber Shandrick focuses on enabling corporate clients to use communications to support their business strategies, enhance and protect their reputation, and respond to public policy challenges. Micho also serves as the chair of the Chamber's Board of Directors. We're honored to have all of you here today, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. And with that, I will turn it over to you to get us started, Micho. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah, for that kind introduction, and welcome Secretary Keneally, Paula, Scott, and Jules to this panel. This is a very timely discussion, given especially that the Delta virus has reminded us that we're going to have to live with uncertainty as a constant for a long time. And we've got a terrific report to ground our discussion. We always knew that technology would usher a new way to work, a future of work. What we did not know is that it would come so suddenly, accelerated by a global pandemic that has triggered a great reset and which has profoundly changed the relationship between employer and employee, between work and family, and certainly between the business community and society. Human capital is driving our economy, and our ability to attract and retain top talent is more important than ever for each one of us in our companies and for the state. So let me start with you, Secretary. Massachusetts, as the report reminds us, great competitive advantages. Number one in patents per capita and capital venture funding per GDP. We're ranked number one most innovative state in America by Bloomberg. Much of the breakthroughs that are getting the world through the pandemic, from vaccines to therapies to testing, are coming from here. So, and of course, our leading higher ed institutions and academic medical centers, which are renowned throughout the world. Yet a lot of headwinds outlined in the report: 560,000 jobs lost in the pandemic, half of our small businesses closed, and inequities that are impossible to ignore have deepened. So given that, and given that you've had a little bit of time to absorb the report, what are the biggest takeaways you have identified? How do you rank the priorities?
Well, great. Well, thank you, Micho, for the question. And first of all, great to be with all of you here today. I want to thank the Chamber for bringing us together for this really important conversation. I also want to thank Nav and Jules and the team at McKinsey for their partnership on this report. It's a really, I think, substantive and important piece of work. And we had a great process to get this one done. I don't know how many Zooms I've been on with Jules now, but it's been quite a few. So great to see you all today. Look, as I said, it's a really important, substantive piece of work. And the overall context here, of course, is that new ways of working, remote and hybrid work, bring about big changes in our economy and our society. And they could lead to a change in the center of gravity, if you will, away from the urban core of Massachusetts. Now, with that may bring some opportunities. But in my mind, there are two main imperatives we need to keep in mind, front and center. One is competitiveness. We simply always have to look at the state's competitive position, and be sure you outline both some of our strengths and weaknesses nicely there. But we got to have this competitive mindset. We got to double down on our strengths. We got to help mitigate our weaknesses, and recognize we're in a changing competitive landscape now with this new world of work. And the second is equity. Recognizing that pandemic and these changes in the workforce have had a disproportional impact on women, minorities, folks with a high school degree or less. So those are the two main takeaways for me. But competitiveness and equity is the two things we need to make sure we address. Now, there's a number of policy areas that drive how we think about this and outline the things we need to get done. I'm happy to talk about these in a lot more detail as we go here today. But in my world, thinking about housing, the fact that we are a high-cost state, and again, this issue of competitiveness, that we're a risk in a world where people can work in a hybrid or remote model. We could be a risk of job growth happening outside Massachusetts versus in Massachusetts. We got to look at the cost of living and working in Massachusetts, and housing is foremost among our concerns. We've been in the middle of a housing crisis now for a long time in Massachusetts, so housing is critically important. Workforce skills training, I think we'll spend some more time on that one as we go forward here this morning. But we will need to, as the report says, reskill people at a scale we've never had to contemplate before. And so workforce skills training is critically important. Another area is supporting our downtowns and our small businesses, recognizing, again, the shift away from the urban core, people working in different ways. We need to reimagine our downtowns and think how to support our downtowns and small businesses differently. We do have a proposal now in front of the legislature to help address all those matters. But those are the overall takeaways for me. It's a very new landscape now. We got to be mindful of two main things: our competitiveness and equity. And there's a number of policy areas we got to be focused on in my world here in housing and economic development, housing, workforce skills, and support for downtowns and small businesses.
Thank you. So let me following up on that, let me throw out a question to the rest of the panel. Where do we go from here in the state, both for the short term, 2025, and for the long term, 2030? And how do we lead in this new environment? Maybe starting, throw it out to all of you, but maybe starting with you, Scott.
So thank you, Micho, and thank you to the Chamber. Appreciate the opportunity to discuss this important topic. In addition to what Secretary Keneally had said, the things that are attractive to us at Columbia Threadneedle would be a supply and an enthusiastic supply of talented employees who want to do great things in the financial services sector. Our relationships with local universities is one of the things that has helped the asset management business broadly really thrive in the city of Boston, and I think we'll continue to do so. So I think continued investment in education. You touched on housing. I believe we're going to talk about housing after that. Housing is an issue, which relates to some of the transportation challenges. For some of our younger professionals, affordable housing is challenging in the downtown area. So we see those professionals moving out to more rural environments where they're more reliant on the commuter rail or different forms of the MBTA, or even driving into work and access to affordable parking. That can be an issue. And lastly, making sure that we invest in the downtown area in a work model that is increasingly partially in an office and partially somewhere else besides your office, creating an overall environment where employees want to come downtown to interact with, build a culture around the companies that they work at. And I think that those things will be really important to us as we seek to make Boston and Massachusetts really as competitive and as equitable as we can in alignment with Secretary Keneally's comments. Thank you.
Paula?
So again, thank you, Micho, and thanks to the Chamber. And I applaud this really outstanding report. And, as I looked at what the report is projecting in terms of the future of industry, but also the need for childcare and affordable housing and the desperate need for retraining, I think that higher education in our state has a major role to play. And I think that it's really one of our competitive advantages here in Massachusetts. We have a tremendous diversity of higher ed in the state that can offer solutions for everything from really creating opportunities for very high-skilled workers in those areas that are rapidly growing in STEM fields, all the way to really retraining. The range from 4-year research universities all the way to liberal arts colleges to 2- and 4-year institutions that are really focused on skill building. These are the opportunities for us. And the need to, as Scott said, he's connected, but I think the need to more, to better connect higher ed with industries across the state could never be greater. And, it is the Chamber has just kicked off its new Higher Education Leadership Council, and that is going to be really at the center of the work. I want to add one thing though that is not in the report, but I think it's important to discuss, which is that as we think about the pipeline into that broad array of STEM fields that we believe are going to be increasing in number, as we think about diversifying those fields, which is very much needed, we have an opportunity here not only to improve access for underrepresented minorities and women, particularly women of color, but we also have to figure out how we change the culture in many of these growing areas. We know that in many of these fields, the significant rate of sexual and gender harassment is a problem. So we can get people into the fields. It's important to keep them in and not have that pipeline leak. So I know we're going to discuss so many of the other issues that are critical: childcare, housing, et cetera, transportation. But I do think higher education is going to be a competitive advantage for us.
Absolutely. And let me take the opportunity to thank you for the time you're spending on the Higher Ed Council for the Chamber co-leading it. We're enormously grateful. I think it's at the center of what we need to do. So thank you. Let me turn it over to Jules. What have been the consistent and emerging trends you're seeing as the pandemic evolves in businesses and employeeship behaviors?
Yes, thank you, Misha.
And particularly, has anything changed since the spring when you conducted the research?
Yeah, it's a great question. And thank you to you and the Chamber for setting up the panel today. It's a great discussion and we feel a very, very important topic. There are really four trends, and we talked about this in the report. There's four trends that we see playing out, and we'll talk a little bit about them and what we see as some of the sort of recent evidence and shifts. I would sort of say that I think one thing we've all learned from the past 18 months is that there's a lot of ups and downs through this pandemic, and so we're all sort of looking for the latest evidence, and we move forward a bit and back a bit, and so we've tried to take an angle here to look beyond that and look out to 2025, 2030, see what we think are going to be the enduring trends, as we emerge from the pandemic, and then step back to say what are some of the opportunities, therefore, to take action around. We talked about four trends here, and a few of them have been touched on already. This overall center of gravity that the Secretary mentioned, this shift, this is probably one of the most fundamental and really anchors some of the other changes. And if you look across Massachusetts, where you've got about a third of the residents able to work remotely, there's a really important question about what happens to those jobs and that type of work post-pandemic. And where we've been coming out as we've conducted this analysis and talked to many folks who I think are on the call here as well, is looking at what form hybrid will take. And we do believe there will be some form of hybrid, whether it's a day a week or so of people working remotely versus 3+ days, has a very significant shift on the nature of work. And if you think about a downtown core like Boston, 250,000 people a day commuting in and out pre-pandemic, you can imagine the significant shift if a meaningful portion of those don't commute in on a daily basis, but just go in on occasion. Think about both what it means for the offices and the downtown core itself, but what it also means for the ancillary businesses that go with them, the coffee shops, the lunch, the dry cleaning, entertainment, hotels, restaurants, all the sort of economy of the core. And so as the Secretary says, it could create real opportunities in suburban areas and other parts of the Commonwealth, but certainly for the many downtown cores across the Commonwealth, it's potentially a significant challenge. Importantly, as we did the analysis, we're not seeing a shift to remote, and there's an important distinction here between hybrid and remote. And so we do think that many of the roles will still be going in with some level of frequency. And so there had been a narrative that said, does everybody just work remote entirely and therefore you sort of never go into the office? I don't think that's the world we're in as best we see for a significant portion of jobs. But this hybrid is likely sustaining, and it is, I think, a big trend that underpins a lot of what we talk about in the report. The second piece is this job reskilling, and I do think this is very, very important for the Commonwealth. Our Global Institute had looked at a whole set of shifts pre-COVID, automation, e-commerce, digitization, and what are the impacts they would have on the nature of work and jobs, and therefore reskilling. And we already felt there was going to be a significant shift. COVID has really been an accelerant for that. And so it's in many ways just been impressive to see how quickly organizations have adapted almost overnight to a different way of working. But as we see these shifts play through the economy, we talk in the report about up to 400,000 job transitions. That's not just somebody leaving a job and going to a similar job. Those are real transitions where there's need for reskilling, a significantly different type of work, significantly different sort of pay proposition, different industry. And so this whole education and reskilling that the Commonwealth is very well endowed in, as Paula mentions, is, I think, a very important theme for us and one of the big trends. We've talked about inequality a bit this morning, and that's one that probably the one that we've seen the most direct impact on so far. And so we look at the unemployment rates amongst different groups, and we see very significant differences by racial group, by gender, And as we look out and try and understand what we think happens for job recovery, we see some, quite concerning trends. Things like women in the workforce likely to be 18 months or more later to get back to where they were before than men. We see some groups like African American groups who suffered 10 to 15% higher percentage point unemployment levels than other racial groups. And so we see very live the implications of equity right now. And then finally, I do think this competitiveness point, job growth moving outside Massachusetts is a real challenge. And we sort of saw a story of two sides as we dug into the analysis. One of a very vibrant economy with incredible growth, great dynamism, a very powerful financial services industry, healthcare industries, and many other sectors that are incredibly successful in Massachusetts. At the same time, we see the housing cost as a real challenge and the housing scarcity, and childcare is the other one. And both of those we see as critical enablers and are playing out already, as I'm sure many of you looking to hire folks in the economy are finding it hard to find people even today, given some of the structural challenges. So those four trends, the central gravity shift, the reskilling, the inequity, and the competitiveness, we really think are the ones that are going to drive the shifts over the coming years.
Interesting. And just to follow up on that, how much have you seen when you talk about the differences, particularly in gender and generations in terms of attitudes towards returning to work? Do you have any insights on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. The gender challenge, I think, ties quite heavily to the childcare challenge, and so there's a shift where many people have lost childcare. There've been challenges around in person in school, and so many of us have been at home with kids. I've got 3 who've been kicking around in the background for much of the last year, and so we've been juggling back and forth with them. And unfortunately, many of the women in the workforce have taken a greater hit and a career hit as a result of that. And so that's certainly one element of it. I think it also, though, reflects a more deep-seated challenge of the gender biases in different sectors. And so there've been a number of sectors and industries and job types that have suffered more, where there've been either gender or racial groups who spend more time in that. We've seen Hispanic workers are very strongly represented in food and hospitality, for example, and that had a very bumpy and challenging time when many of the restaurants were closed down and hotels weren't operating. And so we've seen the challenges play out because of those structural issues as well. I think last thing, Misha, your question on generation, we do see some differences there. I think, without stereotyping, and it of course varies for many different people, but folks who are living out in the suburb with a slightly longer commute, have a house with some space and an office space and so on, are much more likely to be comfortable working from home and less keen to be immediately back into the office. The folks in the downtown core, in the city, in a 1-bed apartment, struggling to manage in their space there, and also people who are newer in their career and want to be visible and be recognized and get those opportunities for apprenticeship and for promotion. They would like to be back in and visible. And so we do see some of that generational shift as well.
Which, of course, for all of us who have worked so hard in creating a diverse and intergenerational, multi-generational culture at the workplace, all of a sudden now we could see just people divide in a way that is not helpful, right? In terms of who's in the class and who's not. But let's stay with childcare, because we want to get into that anyway. We know that the pandemic, all that data, and we know that the pandemic has profoundly changed the boundaries between work and family, figuratively and literally, right? So, Paula, let me turn it to you. Do you think there are specific interventions the state can take? And to Paula and then to everybody else, and what can we do to really address that more intentionally, since we all keep talking about the problem?
Well, this is not something that's going to be solved overnight, because, quite frankly, as a nation, we have not really viewed childcare as infrastructure. And I think we're finally getting to the point where we're recognizing after a crisis that it impacts our economy in such a profound way. And quite frankly, the United States is unique amongst high-income countries to really not invest in this area. So I do think that really this report and raising the issue so that we are beginning to discuss it and also I think we have to think collaboratively at the state level and then across various sectors around really understanding and thinking about different solutions. What are the models that might work? There's no need, I think we've learned, and clearly through higher ed, through the pandemic, that collaboration to solve complex problems and develop solutions or at least ideas for implementation are best done when we can put the best minds together. And I think as a state, we have the ability to do that. I do have hopes as we think about our the infrastructure bill in Congress, and if we can keep that momentum going, I think we can get somewhere. What we're in danger of is moving beyond the crisis moment and actually letting it fall off the table. So I think that really falls, quite frankly, when we say the state, that is all of us. And it's really going to fall to all of us to continue to push this agenda forward, because it is going to lead to a decrease in the ability of women in particular to get back into the workforce, and that hurts the economy.
Thoughts from others, particularly Secretary Keneally?
Well, a number of good points there from Dr. Johnson. It does require a collaborative approach across a variety of stakeholders. I know our Department of Early Education and Care is working now across secretariats and with business groups to help develop a more reliable workforce pipeline, for example. EEC is setting up a business advisory cabinet to work with employers and talk about their needs and come up with more flexible strategies going forward. Also partnering with the Commonwealth Corporation on recruitment strategies to increase the pipeline of early educators to come into the system. And finally, engaging with family groups as well to better understand the family's needs. Against all those strategies, we're deploying about $640 million in federal funds to help drive that strategy. But it very much has to be a collaboration among government, business, families, and getting more talent into the system. More capacity is critical as well.
Yeah. Scott, any thoughts on that?
Pardon me, I had to unmute. It's a very important issue. I'm probably less informed on the government approach to this. I can tell you the local approach at Columbia Threadneedle that we're taking. First and foremost, we are, both our CEO and I are executive sponsors of our women executive team. We are very in tune with some of the issues that our women face as professionals in the asset management industry, both from childcare, but from a variety of different standpoints. So we've made a number of changes to our policies related to lessons learned from COVID. We are, like Secretary Keneally mentioned, we are very active in making sure that our most talented women leaders have clear pathways. So we're addressing it from that side. And then on the recruiting side, we just had a wonderful intern class this year. I think most, at least we're discussing offers with, so we're starting to build a pipeline. That's just one of several ways that we're engaged there. It's a really important topic to address societally. And, we at Columbia Threadneedle would be interested in contributing to the solution.
Thank you. Paula, let me take it back to you. In many ways, we have so much to learn from the higher ed community and the response to the pandemic that you all organized. I think it has been exemplary. You've been at the forefront of addressing the challenges. And of course, incredible luck that the higher ed community had you as a leader in it who are a public health expert through this pandemic. So based on the lessons you've learned over the last 18 months, what advice can you give other large employers as we all begin to think about the future of work?
So, it really, I think, is at a couple of levels, Micho. And, one of the biggest takeaways from the pandemic was really the power of collaboration. And I think there was absolutely unprecedented collaboration across all of higher ed, all different types of institutions, private, public, community colleges, et cetera. And I think under the leadership and through Governor Baker's Higher Education Working Group and our Association of Independent Colleges, which we brought in the state as well, I think that we were able to develop frameworks that were shared across, the everyone from the largest and the wealthiest to those who were small and less endowed. And I think that that is the kind of collaboration, as I said earlier, that is going to be required to really address some of these problems, these critical problems that are in the report. There are just a couple of other things I would say. I think that there's also what we've learned a lot about not only are we employers, but obviously we are educating the next generation of employees. And there are things that we have learned about our students that I think is going to be important for us as an industry to share and to collaborate with other industries. For example, the mental health issues that our students are experiencing at higher and higher rates. And they were only with us for 4 years. They go straight off to industry. I think we've learned a lot through a lot of the hybrid work environments and remote internships. We've also learned what works, how these might actually improve the pipeline. But quite frankly, we've also seen the tremendous isolation of young people. And also, as we think about inequities, the need to make sure that underrepresented minorities and those from low-income backgrounds have the ability to be in person or to learn the culture in a way that transmits frequently what is unspoken. These are all the things that we're going to have to learn as we think about a hybrid work environment. And I do think that partnership around these issues and what we've seen will be helpful.
Thank you. You've also learned what it's like to bring a whole community back at
Yes.
a certain point in time, an exercise that, most businesses are going to have to go through if they haven't already.
Absolutely.
And so I think we've got to build more and more dialogue and learn from what you're seeing, because it's certainly a microcosm of the rest of the businesses.
Yeah,
for sure. Scott, you put a stake in the ground earlier than most of us to downsizing your global headquarters in Boston before the pandemic, as you were shifting towards more remote work in an effort, as you have quoted, saying, develop the optimal work environment for the future. And you signed a lease, I believe, for about half the square footage last fall. So what trends did you identify with your workforce and business needs at that time that led to your decision? And how does it differ across your North American footprint?
And Joe, thank you for characterizing it as insightful and putting a stake in the ground. And I'm humbled by that for sure. Here's what prompted the decision. Our CEO, Ted, and I are very engaged with our employees. Like every organization on this panel and every organization participating in the call, we do engagement surveys and we take to heart a lot of the verbatims. So as we got to really understand some of the concerns on behalf of our employees, we started to ask ourselves, which job tasks, which job families could truly enjoy greater flexibility in their geography and not have to come into the office every day. Simply stated, I thought that it was the definition of insanity to ask a young professional who sits in front of a computer screen and maybe talks on the telephone for a big part of her day to drive an hour to get into the office, to drive an hour home, when the technology exists to facilitate all that engagement, remotely. So we started to work with our senior teams to flush out what that would look like, job family by job family. And what we arrived at was a real estate decision that was characterized as cost save, but it was really designed to enhance the employee's experience with Columbia Threadneedle and to make it a place where people wanted to, practice, and grow their careers. So the rough idea was we felt as though our employees would benefit from being in the office for 3 days a week and working remotely for 2. And we made that decision sometime in the fall of 2019. Again, COVID became much more of a reality for us in the first quarter of 2020. So it looked prescient, but it truly wasn't. And, as we thought about the new space, culturally, an open floor plan in North America is very controversial. We have an open floor in London that is, our employees there absolutely love it. They thrive in that environment. We also have one at our space in New York. And, I can best characterize, you go to the open floor plan in New York and just about all of our employees have those great big headsets on. that build audio walls and walling them off from everybody, defeating the purpose of an open work plan. So it's not quite that. What it is an environment where there are plenty of opportunities and technology that allow our employees who are in the office to engage with those that aren't in the office in that particular day. I call it immersive and seamless. So it's difficult if you're the only person not in the room and you only have a teleconference or a poor video signal to engage with the group. Talk about inequity. It's really hard to get your point across. It's really hard to even get someone to acknowledge that you've got something to say. So the technology allows for a much more seamless and immersive experience for our employees that are there. Culturally, in terms of upskilling, it sounds simple, but the management of multi-channel conversations is a skill set that I think we need to teach our managers and our leaders. I like to think of it as being able to engage. If we happen to use Teams as a platform, we use Zoom sometimes like today. But if I've got a large team meeting, Micho, with on a Teams platform, I can engage with you face to face. I can track some of the emerging themes that are happening in the chat. That's the second dimension. I can bring some of those themes into the big tent if they seem to be getting some gravity to them. And lastly, I can follow up one-on-one with individuals without having to disrupt the flow of the conversation. So in some ways, that's a new skill set. And, when we're talking about this, and Jules, you probably at McKinsey have done much more research on this than I've consumed as I've been thinking about it, and love to consume more. But people always talk about the impact of culture in a more of a hybrid, and how do you preserve that? Well, a big part of what I love to do is walk around and see employees. I can tell you that in a given week pre-COVID, I probably didn't have the chance to do that 40% of the time. I probably did do that around 40%, or 50%, 30% of, the days that I'm in the office, but I wasn't there all the time. So I think the culture that'll emerge will be very different. And we need to take those opportunities when we're all together to build that culture. But different doesn't necessarily mean bad. And, that's a phrase that I use with our team a lot. And, we've already started to build some new cultural norms around what some call a hybrid work environment that we're quite proud of. So that was the decision to move to 290 Congress. As I mentioned to Jim in the pre-call, we're halfway through that move. One of the floors has come online. Our employees really love the location. We're committed to the city of Boston. Our second floor comes online in March of 2022. And, it's where our employees, want to live, where they want to work, and where they want to play.
Thank you. Go ahead, Paul. Go ahead.
I just wanted to add one quick thing, because Scott, I think that you're absolutely right. And I just want to add again, as we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, as we begin to really think about these new ways of work, creating a different culture, it is an opportunity for us to really upfront think about these issues and make sure that we are in a very purposeful way, inclusive, and thinking about those who've tended to be on the sidelines. And that includes, all the groups that we would consider, and also as we onboard young people.
Dr. Johnson, if I could just respond very quickly. Not only do I think that's important, we're seeing it in terms of how we're recruiting. We just made a job offer to a young professional who didn't want to live in Boston. Quite frankly, we would not have had the opportunity to hire this person. She'd like to be in Chicago. That's fine. There's another case where we've got another person from an underrepresented group who wants to live and work in Atlanta, and we've made that work. So we're seeing that in very, very strong ways. So I think it will help our diversity over time.
Thank you. I'll make sure. Go ahead.
If I could just jump in quickly on this idea of competitiveness. This is exactly the dynamic I'm worried about, where we have in our economy, particularly in Greater Boston, vast numbers of people working in technology, professional services, and financial services in jobs that can be done remotely. And they may choose to make their lives somewhere else outside Massachusetts. It's something that ought to be concerning to all of us.
I agree. I totally agree. Let's get to skills and retraining for sure in the couple of minutes we have before we take questions from the audience. So starting with you, Secretary Keneally, the Future of Work report estimates the state will need to retrain 30 to 40,000 workers annually over the next decade to facilitate economic growth. Given the skills gap in mind, how can we best work together to train, upskill, and reskill workers as quickly as employers need it?
Right. It's a great question. Back to my sort of twin aims of competitiveness and equity, that this is an issue that really gets to the heart of both of those. Talent has always been our calling card in Massachusetts. We need to have the most robust talent pipelines we can have. That's critically important. And making sure we have successful career pathways for everybody, regardless of their background or where they live, is also critically important. Early on in the first term, Governor Baker formed something called the Workforce Skills Cabinet, which exists today. It's the Secretaries of Economic Development, Education, and Labor. And our mandate going back to 2015, was in what was then a very full employment economy, how do we close skills gaps in high demand areas around the state, principally healthcare, IT, advanced manufacturing, and the trades. At one point, we had unemployment less than 3%, and we had those industries with a great demand for more talent. And so we worked hard to create more talent in those industries. Today, we have a very different economic context. We have much higher unemployment, but those skills gaps still exist, and those industries still need a lot more talent. If we work together on this issue, and again, this theme of collaboration that's been so prevalent today between the state, employers, employees, and training providers, we can scale this work up. We have proven programs, and we now have a lot more money to put to work. And so I mentioned before the governor's proposal in front of the legislature. The state's received about $5 billion in funds from the American Rescue Plan Act. The governor's proposed to spend $1 billion of that on housing, $350 million of it on downtown revitalization, and importantly for this topic right now, $240 million on workforce skills training. And so we have the programs, we have the resources. We need to work collaboratively, particularly with our large employers as well, to make sure we can scale these programs up. But again, the work we've been doing now for years, trying to create that alignment between our educational institutions and the needs of industry, that work's been ongoing for some time. We need to do it at a different scale for sure.
Let me ask a follow-up on that to Paula. For many college students, internships and part-time jobs are paramount to hands-on training and skill building. What are internships going to look like in a hybrid task force and workforce? And will students be an advantage or at a disadvantage?
Yeah, so it's a good question, Micho, and I referred a little bit to it earlier, which is, we learned a lot during the pandemic. There were many. We at Wellesley and our career ed, and I'm sure our career education program, and this happened across higher education, quickly pivoted with industry to really have a series and a large series of opportunities for remote internships that actually opened the door in many ways to students who may not have had opportunities. And what I mean by that is, student may not have the ability to pay the cost of living, to stay in a particular place, to have an opportunity to stay in the summer in Boston. So maybe they go home and they have an opportunity here. This kind of really opens, I think, the opportunity to experience different areas of quick growth in technology and other STEM fields, as well as other areas. With that, though, as we move, and I mentioned this earlier, as we move to this hybrid environment, I think we're going to have to make this up. We're going to have to understand what this means for what we had considered the traditional internship, and make sure that those who are engaged in it, in these experiences, have the ability to have good, in-depth experiences that give them a good sense for the field and also give them a good sense of the culture in order to retain them, because this is going to be a pathway to retention. Again, discussing the Chamber's work here around higher education, the need to better collaborate between higher ed and industry is significant. And then lastly, just to reiterate again, we have to really consider the impact on those who may not be as on the inside with various industries, women, racial and ethnic minorities, and to make sure students from low income backgrounds, that they really have the opportunity to get a sense of what it's like to be in those industries as they do these internships. And with a hybrid work environment, we're just going to have to figure that out and make sure that that actually happens. But I think that this is the innovation that we're all doing and will happen.
Can I just jump in quickly?
Yes.
There's a number of good points there. We've been very focused on trying to create more diverse talent pipelines, for example, in life sciences and technology across a variety of our programs. You know, this idea of scaling up, it can't just be a government imperative. I think in a lot of ways, the marketplace isn't working right now for our large employers. So really getting our large employers at the table in these high demand industries, working with higher ed, working with our community colleges, our vocational technical schools and others, it's going to be critically important. We can do this. We've got the resources and programs. We need everyone at the table to make it happen.
Mm-hmm.
Micho, if I could just come in very briefly on one aspect.
Take some cues from the floor. So yes, make it brief, please.
Dr. Johnson, this is an area where I think that the better use of technology has improved the intern experience. We had 6 interns from the Posse organization. They worked with multiple employees across different geographies and had, in my opinion, a much broader exposure through the use of platforms like this and a much better sense of what the asset management industry could hold for them. So thank you.
So one question from our audience: how does the transition to a hybrid workforce change investment in our public transit infrastructure? I think that's for you, Secretary Keneally.
Well, from an economic development standpoint, let me say a few things on that. You know, we are very focused on, for example, creating transit-oriented housing and getting more housing near public transit. I know my colleague in the cabinet, Secretary Tessa, will spend a lot of time on ridership numbers and what it means for volume and service levels on the T and the commuter rail. But in my world, we're very focused on creating more housing near public transit. I always say that's smart housing policy, it's smart transit policy, it's smart climate policy. That's one thing. Another is creating economic opportunity all around the state. So then we're not burdening our roads and burdening the typical commuting patterns you've seen before. So there's a number of things we're focused on in our world. I know Secretary Teller's got his hands full on a number of things around public transit, but if we can create more opportunity around the state, again, this idea of centers of gravity shifting and create more housing near public transit, I think that'll serve us well.
Thank you. Another question from our audience: as small biz owners, entrepreneurs, sole proprietors are crucial to our economy, how specifically are your organizations supporting us as we move forward? How often do you look to entrepreneurs for your hiring needs? Scott, you want to take that, or Paula?
Yeah, so, first let me talk about the communities. So I think that, our team in Boston looks to partner with many of the local meeting spaces as we start to do meetings in the back half of this year. I think those relationships have been important. A lot of the vendors that go into that are local providers, so it's certainly something that we consider very closely. I'm aware of, an organization creating pledges to do more with diverse local small employers. We've looked at that. We consider it as part of our process. So I think those are some of the things that we do. Could we do more? Yes, and I think it's important that we do so.
So Micho, I'll just jump in to say, this is an area where we not only need to call on this whole segment of the population, but as we talk about entrepreneurs, this is a huge opportunity for us to, as we focus on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, to really think about how we are supporting or not supporting our entrepreneurs who are women and of minority backgrounds. We all know that I'm not going to repeat the stats in terms of capital that supports these people, but I think that we are a hub of innovation and entrepreneurship, which is, again, an enormous strength. We need to support that strength and make sure that it flourishes on all levels.
I agree with that. And look, the pandemic's been an incredibly challenging time for our smallest companies. It's why we stood up the largest state-sponsored small business relief grant program in the country, $700 million that went to our smallest businesses. We had a focused effort to get the money in the hands of women and minority-owned companies. 46% went to women-owned, 43% went to minority-owned. We've scaled up our small business technical assistance programs at record levels. I've been on a tour this summer. We're hitting 25 downtowns over 7 weeks to really engage with our small businesses in our downtowns and learn about what's happening on the ground. But it's a paramount focus for us, helping our downtowns, helping our small companies.
Thank you. Another question regarding the comments about hiring remotely and increasing the potential hiring pool when positions are permanently remote. How do we create local talent pipelines that provide quality jobs and career pathways to those who are already here in Massachusetts who desire such positions? How do we ensure we're tapping into local talent when remote work is so prevalent?
And oh, sorry, Scott, you go ahead then.
Secretary Keneally, why don't you go first?
Sure. So I'll give you a great example now. When something called our Career Technical Initiative, I'm very grateful to the legislature for funding that for this fiscal year at a very robust level. This is an effort to create more capacity at our vocational technical high schools and our community colleges. And so the model is to have 3 shifts, if you will, in our VOTech schools. Students come in the morning who are enrolled in that school. That's the first shift. The second shift being students enrolled in the high school in that city or town come over in the afternoon. And then a third shift for adults at night. And we think that'll really dramatically increase the throughput of talent, again, in the trades, advanced manufacturing, healthcare, IT, other high demand industries, and making sure those schools are creating programming in close alignment with the needs of employers in their region. So I think it's a good example of how do you create those opportunities all across the state and all of our cities and towns.
Scott, did you want to follow up?
Secretary Keneally, that sounds great. To build on that, just in direct response to the question, our pipeline for talent is really reliant on partnerships with the local schools and universities. So that does, by nature, bring a lot of local people in. And, it is, Boston is an asset management hub. So there's a ton of talent here when people are looking to, make a change or advance in their career. So there's a healthy, component percentage of our talent pipeline that is certainly sourced locally. Not everybody, not every role will have the opportunity to work, remotely, as I described earlier. More will.
Jules, let me direct the next question to you. How do we approach quickly bringing more women back to work, to a new future of work with innovative practices? What have you seen out there?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, there's certainly some enablers that we've talked about. So the childcare challenges, and we do think that when K through 12 school is back in session again, that certainly helps. But the 0 to 5 childcare challenge is clearly one element of it. There's a lot to think about for employers around how can they create roles and jobs that have the flexibility required. And so, you think about different working hours. That we've talked about this extensively, but in practice, most organizations still operate, unless they have particular needs for night shifts and other times, they operate on a sort of 9 to 5 sort of clock. And so typically it's hard if you want to be out and having flexibility for other commitments at say 2 o'clock. It's hard to do that, and some organizations have adapted, but relatively few. And so I do think a big push around thinking more innovatively around what's the working duration as well as the location, but what's the required time you need to be accessible, not just in the office necessarily, but just accessible overall. And are there ways to flex that, create more either part-time or flex time options that allow people to engage in the workforce, but also have the time that they require. And then this point that I think Scott was echoing very well earlier around being thoughtful about, you of course want to create a culture in your organization, you of course want people to interact, but you also don't need them to commute in for a long distance for a role that they could do equally well remotely. And so trying to create and cement in some more of that flexibility. I actually think we have a great opportunity now, Micho, because so many organizations have had to do this over the past 12 to 18 months. And as we transition back to some sort of in-between model, being thoughtful about protecting some roles that have this flexibility so that we can encourage more people into the workforce, women, but also folks with other requirements and create the flexibility so that they can, be an active participant in the workforce, but meet whatever their other commitments are as well. And I don't think that's just going to happen naturally. I think that's going to require employers and the workforce to really, push and challenge to create that. And we'd hope to see the rest of 21 and early into 22 as a period of experimentation in organizations as they start to get more people back in some form and really pushing the envelope around what's required and what flexibility can we preserve.
Thank you. Anybody want to build on that? Or we can take one more.
I would just say, Jules, I couldn't agree with you more. And I would just add to that to say, obviously, this idea of flexibility and the diversity in flexibility needed is really, I think, a key point, because there are those for whom hybrid work, and it is what, so many of us have now developed at least pilots and policies around, is a real benefit. But others may need the flexibility in the hours. And quite frankly, there are others for whom their home environments are not the place where they can work. And I think we have to recognize that. And then there are those who have to be on site because the job really requires it. And then what does flexibility mean for them? What is it that they need? So I think this whole range and putting order and structure to that is a place where I do think sharing our learnings, and I think that that's going to really be important around really understanding the overarching experiences that various industries are having so that we can all learn what are some of the best practices.
Thank you. So let's go to the closing question. And I apologize to our audience that we didn't get to all the questions, but there have been many and there'll be more of these sessions. It just underscores the need for this kind of dialogue. But for each of the panelists, what's the most important thing employers can begin to do now to set themselves and their workforces up for success in the face of even more change to come? We'll start with you, Scott.
You mentioned policies and thinking about, how hybrid can work. I would say to start to engage with your employees, with your leaders on what those ought to be and have a framework to make these decisions nimbly into the future, whatever that future may hold. I think that dialogue and that thinking around policies and procedures is maybe the most important thing.
Jules?
Yeah, I would say, we've seen, of course, in the last 18 months, change at an unprecedented pace. We don't think that's going to slow down. We just see, accelerating change in the way that we work and for all of these trends we talk about here. So I would say focusing on the talent, understand what your people are looking for, what your employees and future employees are looking for, and then find ways to be adaptable and flexible, to the point we were just making. In times of change, adaptability is really what helps organizations get through. And so understanding what the workforce needs and talent is just so incredibly important to future growth in our economy, and then trying to be adaptable and flexible to the needs of that workforce as well as the needs of your organization. And I think that's really got to be the focus, and it's going to be an ongoing dialogue over many months. And I would just underscore, as Dr. Johnson was saying, it's not going to be the same for everybody. Different groups are going to have different requirements, different people, different companies. We've talked a lot about hybrid work, but still the majority of the economy is not in a hybrid model. And so, what does flexibility and adaptability mean there? So I think that focus on talent and adaptability, that's what I'd really underscore.
Dr. Johnson.
So I resonate. I really agree with both Jules and Scott's comments. And what I would say, just to begin with, is that, I think COVID's going to be with us for quite a while. And that the first thing we need to do is we need to learn how to live with this disease. And that's going to require just keeping the science and public health at the forefront of our decisions and protocols, et cetera. So I think probably it goes without saying, but I think it's worth saying. And then I would just say that we have to keep the lessons from the pandemic at the forefront and really, again, tap our higher education, the diversity of higher education, which is a competitive advantage. And I think we also just have to be really more intentional about how we work together, how we remain agile, collaborative, and inclusive.
Thank you. Secretary Keneally.
Well, I'd say there's two things. One is getting people vaccinated, because that will be the ultimate game changer here with the pandemic. But secondly, working with us on these workforce skills challenges. We have industries that are incredibly exciting industries that have a demand for more talent, that express a desire to have a more diverse talent base on the one hand, and then we have hundreds of thousands of people that need a different employment pathway. And there's a model here for all of us to work together to make that happen. We can do it at the kind of scale we need, but it requires the kind of intense collaboration to make it happen.
Thank you. And before I turn it to Jim, I just want to thank the panelists for a terrific discussion and to say that we've heard over and over the need for collaboration. And we certainly at the Chamber are committed to playing a role in that and deepening the collaboration between government and industry to lead and higher ed to lead us out of this incredible moment in time. So thank you all, and back to Jim.
Well, thank you, Micho, and thank you, Scott, Dr. Johnson, Secretary Keneally, and Jules for your insightful and really fantastic conversation. Our business community is thankful for your leadership, your wisdom, and the hard work I know that you're all doing in this time of recovery. And to all our viewers, I hope you'll remain engaged with this series of programs in which we share resources and collaborate in the way that our panel suggested today. We aim to make this an educational program so that we'll all learn. Before we break here, on behalf of the Greater Boston business community, we want to honor the lives of the men and women who lost their lives in Afghanistan last week in service to our country, and express our heartfelt condolences to their family and of course our gratitude for their service, and pray for a peaceful resolution to all that's going on in that country. And we also share and send our prayers to our fellow Americans in the Gulf Coast as they recover from Hurricane Ida, and we're grateful to see that Massachusetts is sending down resources to help with that recovery. So much to pray for, but much to be thankful for. And thank you all for joining us today, and I hope you all enjoy this final days of summer, and hope you'll join us for future conversations like this. Thank you.